Y las moriscas.
Hello and welcome to Islam in the Middle Ages, a series for IHSHG examining the Islamic world from Muhammad to the Mughal Empire on the first Sunday of each month. In our last episode, we took a look at the empires of Mali and Songhai and saw how Western Africa was home to one of the richest economic hubs in all of the medieval world, as well as a thriving centre of Islamic culture and scholarship. We looked at the growth of trade in the Sahel, the fascinating oral history of Sunjata, the wealth of Mansa Musa, the reforms of Askia Muhammad, and the empire's ultimate, and indeed unfortunate, decline at the end of the 16th century. In this episode, we're going all the way to the other side of the Islamic world to take a look at one of the most important powers of the Islamic Middle Ages, a group that totally disrupted life in the Middle East and Central Asia, and set in place a legacy that other empires would pick up hundreds of years after they had gone. I am, of course, talking about the Mongols, warriors and nomads from the steppes north of China, who built the largest continuous land empire in the entirety of human history. Over the course of this episode, we'll chart their extraordinary rise to power and see the remarkable things they achieved as rulers of this enormous mass of land, including the biggest astronomy tower in the Islamic world, the first uses of gunpowder outside of China, the first system of visas and passports, and the emergence of poets as famous in the Islamic world as Shakespeare is in the West. This is an amazing story, one of the rise and fall of an enormous imperial power in just the space of a century, and I hope you'll enjoy learning about them today as much as I have researching them for this episode. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of the IHSHG, and I would like to thank them for giving me the platform to be able to host this. Do be sure to check out their website, Facebook page, and YouTube channels for more historical discussions in English and Portuguese. So, let's begin. The story of the Mongols begins in 1206, with the crowning of a powerful clan leader named Temujin. Born in 1162, he served as advisor, or Nokhor, to the leader of the Karaits, one of several clans of nomadic herdsmen that roamed the steppes of what is today Mongolia and eastern Siberia. This was a challenging part of the world to thrive in. The landscape was flat, dry grassland, unfit for settled agriculture, where food could become scarce in especially harsh winters or summers. Like the Vikings of Scandinavia, this drove the residents of this part of the world to sometimes loot and plunder the more fertile lands to the south, to give themselves resources and wealth they otherwise wouldn't be able to find. The clans of the Mongols also regularly feuded between themselves to avenge wrongdoing, leading to a dangerous and often complex network of relationships between them throughout their history. Clans could even fight internally if divisions between leaders became too great, and this was the situation that Temujin found himself in at the start of the 13th century, when open conflict broke out between himself and Tugril, the leader of the Karaits. Temujin eventually emerged in 1204 victorious, but only after a string of embarrassing defeats that nearly saw him executed several times. In 1206, through a remarkable feat of alliance building and networking, Temujin had managed to unite a great number of Mongol clans under his banner. He declared that he had been ordained by heaven to bring the whole world to peace under the leadership of one ruler. Those who joined him would share in the bounty of victory, and those who opposed him would surely perish. Note here that heaven has a slightly different meaning to the place of paradise in Islamic, Jewish, and Christian cosmology. Here, we mean the will of the ancestors that many Mongol clans venerated, or alternatively, the god of the blue sky, Tengri. Temujin called for clans to put aside their differences, unite together, and answer the call that heaven had sent to fulfill their preordained destiny. I'm sure listening to this, you can already draw parallels to Saladin, the Seljuks, and even the Arabs in the time of the Prophet. And just like then, a powerful religious call to arms, coupled with the promise of conquest and wealth, proved a powerful force to bind together many different people that were once enemies. Temujin named his grand alliance the Khamag Mongol Ulus, or All Mongol State, and took a regal name meaning stern king. In Mongolian, this translates to Chinggis Khan, or as it's better known as today, Genghis Khan. I'll use the latter name throughout this podcast for the sake of simplicity. I'll pause here to say that this is an educated guess as to the early life and history of Genghis Khan. Like any figure in history with his infamy and gravitas, writing about him is difficult. Our sources for his life are problematic, and, being such an iconic figure, there are a great many rumours and apocryphal stories about him. Even his final resting place is hotly contested between several different burial sites. There are two key types of source that give us insights into Genghis's life and his early empire. The first is a source written by the Mongols themselves, documenting the life and legacy of Genghis Khan, known as the Secret History, written in 1227, shortly after Genghis's death. This is a fascinating document that not only outlines Genghis Khan's life, but also much of his ideology and motivations in a broad corpus of history, epic poetry, and tracts of wisdom that lay out what Genghis believed a good leader ought to possess. These tracts, known as bilig, would later go on to form the basis for both a code of conduct for the Mongols' military and also a law code for the nomadic peoples of the Mongol Empire, acting rather like hadith in Islam, that laid out the Prophet's words, deeds, and actions to show the best way to live. This source is enormously valuable. It's an amalgamation of Mongolian oral tradition and gives us the most complete account of Genghis Khan's life. In addition, it also allows us to see the Mongols' conquests through their eyes and to understand why they took the actions that they did. However, like all oral traditions, this text must be read with the caveat that the tradition is likely to have changed and morphed over time, and that fantasy elements get mixed in with that fact for narrative purposes. It's a complicated and often contradictory text to understand, with many difficult cultural and linguistic nuances to wrap one's head around. But if it is read within this, however, with the appropriate references, it's absolutely invaluable for understanding the early years of the Mongol Empire's history. The second set of sources available are of course those written from the lands that the Mongols went on to conquer, such as accounts from the Persian scholars Juvayni and Rashid ad-Din. These sources are enormously valuable in understanding how people who lived through the Mongols' conquests understood and processed the devastation and those that wrought it, and gave us insights into what played out between the Mongols and the people they interacted with. However, these tend to suffer from two of the more common issues one has to grapple with when looking at primary evidence. They are either written by scholars patronized by Mongol dynasties seeking to validate themselves, or by people forced to flee their homes and livelihoods, who understandably write in extremely scathing terms about these people. Arguably, the stereotype we have today of the Mongols being nothing more than violent pillagers comes from the sources like these, that sometimes exaggerated just how terrible they were. As always then, our source materials provide us with challenge and opportunities in equal measure, and it's always worth keeping in mind that the neat, clean narratives we like to spin in history are the products of educated guesswork and trying to make unreliable and often contradictory narrators speak to one another. The Mongols' initial conquests were limited, mostly scrapping with kingdoms in northern China that had set themselves up as rivals to the ruling Song dynasty in the south. For the first 4 years of their empire, they were largely peripheral to events in the Islamic world, and things could easily have stayed that way were it not for a fatal diplomatic blunder committed by what was then the most prominent ruler in Central Asia at the time. To better understand this, it's worth first looking at the course of Persian history over the course of the 12th century to see how the first great power the Mongols took on came into being. In 1157, with the rise of the Zangids under Nur ad-Din in the Middle East, the empire the Seljuks created in Persia and the Levant fell apart. In their place rose one of their former vassal states, known as Khwarezm. Like the Seljuks before them, they were an alliance of elite slave soldiers who ruled as a military power, negotiating with city-states and Turkic tribes in the region to ensure peace from them. Their rise was rapid and frankly impressive, taking over a territory that stretched from Iraq to present-day Pakistan, and securing the approval of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, a figure that was still just about holding on to power in this period, but in a greatly diminished state, often with the sole purpose of rubber-stamping the legitimacy of any new conquering powers in the region. The rising star of Khwarezm was Qutb ad-Din Muhammad, a successful military conqueror who even revived the ancient Persian title of Shah. By 1210, he had expanded his territories throughout Central Asia, even into the borders of Afghanistan, which, just like today, proved difficult to conquer and rule by outside powers. He had also recently reopened the Silk Roads to China, capitalizing on the valuable flow of goods from the Song dynasty to bolster his state further. It was in this period that the iconic blue and white ware that we tend to associate with fine Chinese porcelain was becoming fashionable in the Islamic world. The opening of this route, however, put him in striking distance of the now expanded Mongol state, who had recently won a decisive victory against the militaristic kingdom of Jin in what is today northeast China. Qutb ad-Din was initially cordial, although rather arrogant, trying to sell Genghis Khan trade goods from China at inflated prices. Genghis promptly wrote back to him, asking if he assumed the Mongols had never seen such goods before. Undeterred though, Genghis sent Uyghur merchants to negotiate business with Khwarezm in 1218. Initial negotiations proved successful, but then a crisis broke out when the governor of Otrar, a trading city in the south of present-day Kazakhstan, accused the merchants of spying and beheaded them. Furious that this had happened, Genghis demanded that the governor be sent to him to face retribution. When Qutb ad-Din refused, Genghis declared war, crossing into Khwarezmian territory with 150,000 Mongol and Uyghur horsemen. When he reached Otrar, in a move that wouldn't look out of place in an episode of Game of Thrones, Genghis Khan had the governor murdered by pouring molten silver down his throat. In the year that followed, it became bleakly apparent what Qutb ad-Din had unleashed on his lands by refusing Genghis's demands. The Mongol army went on a vicious killing spree around the major cities of Khwarezm, burning them to the ground and killing everyone inside, whilst looting and pillaging as they went. This was an exercise in controlled terror. Genghis would form his army outside the walls of a city and demand their surrender. If they did, he'd administer a new governor and leave the city in peace, collecting regular taxes as tribute. If they refused, however, the city would be totally leveled alongside all of their inhabitants, including non-combatants and children. Either out of pride or fear that they'd be betrayed, many cities in this region refused, something that led to the death of millions as the Mongols exacted their brutal conquest. In some areas, they'd commit especially gruesome warnings to others, such as stacking skulls in piles outside of the walls of the conquered city. After taking Bukhara, Genghis Khan even had the audacity to take over Friday prayers and tell the faithful of the great mosque there, if you had not committed such great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you. The number of deaths caused by this rampage is difficult to predict, but it's estimated to have been in the hundreds and thousands, if not millions. And it's for this reason that the Mongols have garnered such a grisly reputation. They were seen to wipe out entire cities and kingdoms in their wake, causing cataclysmic levels of damage, especially by medieval standards. As utterly horrific as this was, though, it did mean that later cities would quickly surrender to avoid the same fate. And it begs mention that those who surrendered didn't fare too badly, with many cities commenting that the taxation levied on them by the Mongols was lighter than the Turkish warlords of the past 2 centuries, and finding that they could continue largely as they had before. The Mongols had little interest in politically interfering with the territories they conquered, so were quite happy to allow those they conquered to continue as they had before, leading to a surprisingly tolerant climate emerging within their lands, in spite of the devastation. Genghis's conquests continued after the Khwarezmian Empire collapsed. His armies bore deep into Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, attacking more cities and building a sizable network of tributary kingdoms in their wake. The Pope in Rome did attempt to ward off Genghis by threatening that God would smite him down if he attacked Christian kingdoms, only for Genghis to write back pointing out that he had already conquered many Christian domains in the Middle East and around the Black Sea, without anything bad actually happening to him. After Genghis's death in 1227, his successor Urgedei bore deep into Europe and took over what remained of China and Korea, leading by his death in 1241 an empire that stretched from Eastern Europe to the furthest tips of Asia. This naturally begs the question, what made the Mongols so successful? And why were they able to conquer one of the largest empires in all of history in the space of just 14 years? I would argue that there were 3 things that drove the Mongols to be as good as they did: military tactics, organization, and leadership under Genghis Khan. In terms of tactics, the Mongols were devastating on the battlefield, with a core of mobile horse archers that could easily outmaneuver the infantry-based armies of their enemies, as well as cutting-edge siege weapons that included some of the earliest uses of gunpowder outside of China, such as trebuchets that fired exploding shells, crude bombs that took the form of wooden tubes packed with shrapnel, and even the earliest forms of rockets, arrows that used gunpowder fuses for propulsion. Although these weren't especially accurate, powerful, or indeed reliable, they did terrify and scatter enemy formations, making them effective for shock tactics before advancing on the enemy line. The Mongols were also cunning and adaptive, and able to alter their tactics on the fly. When the Mongols invaded northern Jin, for example, they besieged the thick walls of their capital by painstakingly diverting a river to flood the city out and knock out its best defences. The Mongol army too was organised in efficient divisions that resembled the formation of a modern army more than the militia and mercenaries that medieval fighting forces tended to be comprised of. To prevent infighting between the clans that joined the all-Mongol nation, Genghis Khan amalgamated his fighting force into one major organisation, commanded by leaders appointed on merit, who were allowed to act independently in the field, making the army adaptable and flexible, rather than just one big formation that had to act on the same orders. The army was divided into 3 main units: squads of 10, known as Arban, 100, known as Jagun, and 1,000, known as Mingan. One more unit, known as Tumen, or 10,000, was added as the empire's military grew in the imperial period, and at the height of the empire, the Mongols had 1 million riders under arms. The Mingan was the backbone of the Mongol army, and included not just the individual soldier, but their family too, so that the Mingan could provision and supply itself whilst out on the field more easily than other armies at the time. To consolidate unity further, Genghis Khan commissioned a personal bodyguard known as the Keshik, whose officers were recruited from the sons of clan leaders who joined Genghis. On top of all of this, the Mongols also allowed the armies of conquered cities, as well as rival nomadic groups, to join their ranks and bring their own forms of fighting with them. This allowed the Mongols to acquire siege experts from northern China, for example, or especially fierce heavy lancers from eastern Persia, allowing them to build a sizable and adaptive fighting force with relative ease. Finally, it's worth mentioning that Genghis Khan himself consistently proved himself to be a leader par excellence. As historian John Mann has identified, many of Genghis Khan's qualities as a leader were highly impressive. He had a strong vision and absolute conviction that he would succeed, coupled with tactical bouts of ruthlessness that, whilst considered horrific by today's standards, nevertheless allowed him to thrive in the cutthroat world of medieval Central Asia. He also promoted people on talent, regardless of their background, was pragmatic and able to take calculated risks, gained a reputation for integrity and consistency, and maintained an austere, simple lifestyle, often camping out with his men and sharing their troubles, all of which made him a leader to be feared and, above all, respected. It Babe mentions too, of course, that he also allowed conquered territories to continue largely as they had before, which gave a great deal of stability to his empire, as many individuals were able to carry on just fine if they surrendered. Which, as we've seen many times before on this podcast, even going back to the early Arab conquests, is an excellent way to build up an empire in a short space of time. Genghis Khan's success as a leader perhaps comes through most prominently when you compare this to leadership theorist Daniel Goleman's 18 competencies of a successful leader. Out of 18, historian John Mann has identified that Genghis exhibited 15 of these traits, with just qualities more suited for modern leaders, such as conflict resolution and teamwork, not being covered. This stands testimony to the fact that the Mongols at this time were led by a talented, potent leader, which, when combined with their tactics and structure, made them a ferocious army that few other powers in the region were able to effectively rival. In the 1240s, however, a crisis hit the empire as Ugadei died with disputes over his succession. This was a precarious territory to tread, as the empire now lacked one guiding leader and threatened to break into civil war, something that, as we've seen many times before on this podcast, tended to disrupt even the most successful dynasties of this period. Eventually, though, under the excellent guidance of Bertei, Genghis Khan's late wife and chief consort, the empire was split into 4 different pieces, each ruled by Genghis Khan's sons, so that they could stake their claim in peace. The Golden Horde, centered around the Black Sea, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and Iraq, and the Yuan dynasty, who ruled as a joint Mongol-Chinese power in the territories of the Song and its rival kingdoms. We'll look more at the Ilkhanate in more depth in this episode, as the majority of the Islamic world under Mongol control was situated here. Based in the old territories of Khwarezm, the Ilkhanate rose to prominence in the 1250s. In an extraordinary series of conquests, they managed to besiege Baghdad in 1257 and depose the Abbasid Caliph, ending the caliphate altogether temporarily until the rise of the Ottomans in the 16th century. At about the same time, the mountaintop castle of Alamut was besieged and destroyed, putting an end to the ferocious assassin order in Central Asia, after the assassins' attempt to kill the Ilkhanid ruler Munkeh Khan without much luck. The Ilhanids expanded deep into Iraq, and even gained a foothold in the Middle East, only to be checked in 1265 by the Mamluks at Ain Jalut. one of the very few times the Mongols were defeated in the 13th century. Despite this unfortunate setback, however, the Ilkhanate managed to carve out for itself a sizable and wealthy territory in the Middle East and Persia. Far from being just military conquerors, though, the Ilhanids were also keen to promote culture and art. The first Ilkhanid ruler, Hulagu, was an especially avid patron. He invested heavily in agriculture and crafts to raise the funds to commission fine works, establishing a number of ambitious projects, such as the El-Jaitu tomb in Sultania. Scholars were also warmly welcomed at the Mongol capital in Merv, especially linguists who could send messages and letters written in the broad variety of languages the Mongol Empire encompassed, and historians, such as the scholar Juvayni, who wrote the key histories of the Ilkhanids and the fall of Khwarezm. Astronomers were welcomed too, especially given that the Mongols had a keen interest in portents from the stars. The most famous of these scholars was a Persian named Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi, who was appointed chief astronomer in the Ilkhanid court. El-Tusi began his career in the service of the assassins, performing observational work in the towers of Alamut. Following the fall of the assassin order, he was arrested and taken to Merv, whereupon he was allowed to live in return for studying astronomy for the Mongol court. After explaining that he couldn't accurately see the stars in the palace at Merv, the ruler Menghe had a sizable observatory built for him near the city of Tabriz called Maragar, 4 stories high and 92 feet in diameter, meaning it would have been the largest astronomy center of its type in the world at the time. Maragar was complete with 4,000 books preserved from Alamut, as well as facilities for 100 staff and students, with enrollments coming in as far as Byzantium and China. Chinese scholars especially were drawn to Tabriz, as the Yuan ruler Kublai Khan isolated the educated elite of China, preferring Tibetan Buddhist monks to the traditional corpus of Confucian scholars to administer his court. The influx of students were also aided by the fact that the Ilkhanids were religiously tolerant, accepting Sunnis, Shiites, Jews, Nestorian Christians, Tengrists and Buddhists into their courts and centers of learning. El-Tusi proved to be a particular asset to scholarship in the Ilkhanate. He had a keen interest in the great medics and astronomers El-Biruni and Ibn Sina, as well as Plato and Aristotle. He wrote 150 treatises until his death in 1274 on a variety of subjects in mathematics, astronomy, and biology. In some of his treatises, he speculated that animals may have developed specific adaptations to their environment, and in another, suggested that the Earth span on an axis and was part of a regular series of orbits around the Sun that could be exactly measured and calculated. Poetry and literature also saw a major revival under the Ilkhanids, with some of the most impressive tracts of literature in the entire Islamic Middle Ages being written in this period. This trend was spurred on by 2 key developments that happened prior to the Mongol rule over Persia, and was accelerated by the conquest and subsequent avenues for patronage it offered. The first key trend was the revival of Persian language and literature that had been going on since the 10th century. Unlike many of the territories the early Arabs conquered, Persia resisted the general trend of Arabizing its culture, and through continued interest in its pre-Islamic roots, Persian survived as a scholarly and literary language, with individuals continuing to write and adapt poetry and stories that blended Islamic culture with that of ancient Persia. This was coupled by the rise of Sufism, a form of mysticism in Islam that seeks deep, intimate experiences of closeness to God through chanting, meditation, and practices not normally undertaken in mainstream Islam. Sufis in this period taught their followers to find personal communion with the divine, to reject wealth and status, and to put piety above political allegiance, something that resonated with many in this unstable time, causing the movement to rapidly grow in popularity and attract lots of members to their cause. They also found a lot of following amongst the newly converted Turkic elites of Central Asia too, given its parallels to Tengrism and shamanism. Both of these, taken together, form the basis for an extremely rich revival of Persian poetry and literature in this period, and inspired some of the greatest writers of the Islamic world at the time. The three most prominent authors of the Ilhanids were Nizami Ganjavi, a novelist and epic poet whose works included a tragic love story with comparable themes to Romeo and Juliet and a retelling of the history of Alexander the Great, as well as Sadi Shirazi, an author and philosopher who wrote on issues of morality and faith, and the famous Sufi poet Rumi, who wrote on a variety of topics relating to Sufism, internal reflection, and transcending the material world to find the spiritual. Of these three, Rumi has proven especially influential, and his work continues to shape the culture of Iran and beyond even into the present day. Modern Persian artists, such as Mohsen Shavoshi, reference his writings in their songs and use his themes as inspiration. I'm going to give the topic of literature a whole episode in its own right at a later date, as it really deserves explanation in more depth. But for now, it suffices to say that this too contributed to the rich tapestry of arts and culture that existed under the Ilhanids at the time. On top of all of this, a number of reforms were put into place across the empire to turn it into an efficient, connected organisation. The recruitment of bureaucrats from many different people groups allowed the Mongols to communicate across their territories rapidly and efficiently in the languages of their people. They even commissioned scholars to produce a variety of written scripts for Mongolian, so that they could write and administer documents better. To protect messages and enhance communications and trade, the Mongols also implemented an early form of visa, known as the gareg, that guaranteed protection for messengers moving in between their territories, with 4 tiers of importance, starting at wood, and then moving on to bronze, silver, and finally gold. On top of this, whilst they let their conquered territories largely govern themselves as they did before, they issued law codes to better control the often unpredictable nomadic peoples of their empire, using laws based off of Genghis Khan's Beylig and oral traditions of the different peoples under their rule. The result was a tolerant empire that successfully balanced respecting the individual cultures and beliefs of its people with the need for centrality and interconnectedness. In fact, conquests from 1220 to 1320 created a century of peace that historians have dubbed the Pax Mongolica, where Central Asia enjoyed a period of relative peace within its borders. Given the divisions in the region for the 2 centuries after the collapse of the Abbasids, this was therefore an impressive feat, and testament to the prowess the Mongols had for empire building. Sadly though, it wasn't to last. One of the enduring legacies of the empire's partition was the fact that each of the successors of the states didn't quite recognize each other as legitimate. Without an effective central power to keep them in check, the Ilkhanate fought on and off with rivals in the Golden Horde and Chagatai Khanate for a century, sometimes over dynastic disputes, and other times over religious and sectarian causes that worsened as each dynasty became increasingly entrenched within their own territories and turned their backs on the traditional model of tolerance. The Golden Horde and Ilkhanate, for example, clashed frequently from the 1300s onwards over allegations that Muslims were persecuted in the Golden Horde. This continued as the 14th century rolled on, and was exacerbated as each polity faced succession crises of its own and minor lords fighting for the throne of these successor states. Then, from 1335 to 1368, each of the major powers began to fragment apart off the back of infighting and clashing with each other. Some of these, like the Yuan and Chagatai Khanate, fell gradually over time, whilst the Ilkhanate shattered rapidly over the course of 1335 as successors fought with each other. By 1370, the Mongol Empire was no more, fracturing into a number of smaller, warring kingdoms. It was an unfortunate end for this extraordinary imperial project, and one of the most wildly successful powers of the Islamic Middle Ages. The Mongols, as we have seen, were fascinating figures who managed to take over and administer one of the most fraught regions of the world at the time, and continued the work of ruling and administering the Middle East and Persia as a military elite. Their tactics, organisation, and leadership in their early years made them impressive, and under the Ilhanids of Persia, Central Asia continued to thrive in one of the most challenging periods in the history of the Islamic world. Sadly though, as is so often the case, disunity caused the empire to eventually fissure and collapse, as competing powers vied for what they felt was their rightful inheritance. In what remained of the Chagatai Khanate, however, in the city of Samarkand, the warlord Timur began to conquer territories of his own, hoping to restore the glory of the Mongol Empire through his works. And it would be him that would go on to forge the great Islamic empires of the 14th and 15th centuries, reviving Mongol power briefly and creating an impressive, diverse polity with a renewal of arts and literature. In the next episode, we'll examine his rise to power, his attempts to revive the empire of his forefathers, and the legacy he left on the Islamic world that would be taken up by the three great empires that came into being after him. Thank you very much for listening, and see you in the next episode.